There is a specific kind of sound an expensive leather boot makes when it kicks your late mother's porcelain teacup onto wet gravel. It does not just shatter. It crunches under the heel with a cold, deliberate cruelty that echoes deep inside your chest. 4 years ago, on a bitter October evening, I stood on the curb outside my family's ancestral home in the pouring rain. The water ran down my collar, soaking through my thin linen shirt, while 2 heavy black trash bags containing every possession I had left in the world were tossed onto the muddy pavement. On the dry, lit porch stood my stepmother, Helen, her arms folded across her chest, a faint, mocking smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Beside her stood her daughter, Nicole. Around Nicole's neck was the heirloom diamond pendant my mother had given me on my 9th birthday. And standing right between them, framed by the warm glow of the chandeliers inside, was Daniel. Daniel was the man I was supposed to marry in 3 weeks. We had picked the flowers. We had sent out 400 invitations. We had promised each other our futures. Yet there he stood, dry and untouchable, wearing the watch my father had given him as an engagement gift. He did not say a single word of defense. He did not even look me in the eye. He simply raised his wrist, checked the time, and pulled the heavy wrought iron security gate shut with a sharp, metallic click. They thought they had taken everything from me. They believed they had left me with no dignity, no money, and no ground to stand on. They did not know that 48 hours earlier, my dying grandfather had made a private phone call from his intensive care room. And they certainly did not know that last night, when Daniel walked into the city's most exclusive VIP club to celebrate spending $40 million on my family's heritage, the general manager would look him dead in the eye, return his credit card, and speak the very words that destroyed his entire existence. To truly understand the depth of this betrayal, you have to understand my grandfather, Haroon. Grandfather Haroon was an architectural visionary and a self-made titan. In the late 1970s, he acquired 60 acres of raw hillside overlooking the valley and built the Sovereign. It was an iconic, master-crafted estate that quickly became a state landmark. Every arched stone corridor, every hand-carved mahogany banister, and every stained glass panel was drafted by his own hands. But more than a luxury residence, that house was the heartbeat of our family. When my mother passed away from leukemia when I was only 8 years old, the Sovereign became my fortress. I spent my childhood sitting on the floor of grandfather's grand library, watching him sketch blueprints while the scent of aged cedar, parchment, and pipe tobacco filled the room. He would tap my forehead with the back of his drafting pencil and tell me that buildings are like people. If a foundation is built on vanity, the first winter storm will tear it down to the dirt. But if it is built on patience and quiet grit, it will stand long after the storm has passed. Then, my father brought Helen into our home. Grief has a way of making strong men vulnerable, and my father was utterly lost after my mother died. He married Helen when I was 12, and she brought her daughter Nicole with her. On the surface, Helen played the sweet, accommodating wife whenever my father was around. But the very second his car pulled out of the driveway for business trips, her warm facade melted away. She treated our longtime domestic staff like disposable servants, and she treated me like an inconvenient squatter in my own home. Nicole was carved from the exact same stone. She was entitled, vicious, and constantly took whatever she wanted from my room, convinced that being Helen's daughter entitled her to the Haroon family legacy. When my father unexpectedly suffered a fatal heart attack during my final year of college, the thin sheet of civility keeping the house together snapped completely. Helen immediately proclaimed herself the sole head of the household. There was only one obstacle standing between Helen and the complete destruction of our family estate: grandfather Haroon. Grandfather lived in the west wing of the property. Even though his heart was growing weaker by the month, his intellect was as razor-sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. He saw straight through Helen's greed. He openly refused to let her touch the estate accounts or alter the property titles. For as long as grandfather drew breath, Helen and Nicole were forced to bite their tongues and maintain a basic level of decency toward me. That was when Daniel walked into my life. Denial belonged to a prominent old money family whose business empire had quietly dried up over the last decade. He was handsome, polished, and exceptionally charming. He courted me for nearly 2 years with calculated precision. He sent rare white orchids to my workplace, attended my architectural restoration exhibits, and spoke passionately about building a life together rooted in family legacy. Looking back now, the red flags were blazing in plain sight, but when you are grieving your parents, kindness looks like love. I believed he was my safe harbor. I did not realize Denial was merely running a private balance sheet in his head. He looked at my grandfather's declining health, calculated the market value of the sovereign, and decided that marrying me was his quickest shortcut back to absolute wealth. We got engaged, and a grand autumn wedding was planned. Then, 2 months before we were due to walk down the aisle, Grandfather Haroon suffered a massive respiratory collapse. He was rushed to the city hospital and placed into an intensive care unit under medically induced sedation. The moment Grandfather was unconscious in a hospital bed, the predators made their move. Helen stopped all pretense. She began ordering demolition crews to strip away my mother's handcrafted garden arches and replaced our vintage furniture with garish, gold-plated velvet couches. Nicole began wearing my mother's jewelry right in front of me, daring me to say a word. Whenever I confronted them, Denial would pull me into the hallway, grip my wrist with uncomfortable firmness, and tell me to be quiet. He would say that we had to keep Helen happy so the estate transition went smoothly after the old man passed away. I thought he was trying to protect our future peace. In reality, he had already changed his allegiance to whoever he thought held the keys to the kingdom. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday night, 4 weeks before our wedding date. I came home early from the hospital after spending 14 hours sitting by Grandfather's bedside. The rain was drumming heavily against the roof of the grand house. As I walked silently through the marble foyer, I heard clinking crystal glasses and loud, mocking laughter echoing from the second-floor drawing room. I walked up the carpeted staircase and stopped outside the cracked double doors. There, sitting on the long velvet settee, was Denial. His arm was wrapped comfortably around Nicole's shoulders. Helen was standing by the fireplace, pouring champagne into crystal flutes. Nicole was giggling, resting her head on Denial's chest, mocking the way I looked at the hospital. Denial laughed softly, taking a sip of champagne, and said that dealing with my emotional exhaustion was unbearable. He told Helen that once the old man flatlined, they would finalize the probate paperwork, push the property transfer through, and sell off the Commercial Valley land for $50 million. Helen raised her glass and made a toast to trading in the boring daughter for the upgrade. My entire reality shattered in that second. The blood in my veins turned to ice. The man who had kissed my forehead that very morning was casually cutting up my life with the 2 people who hated me the most. I pushed the door open. The heavy doors hit the wall with a hollow thud. Nicole did not even bother pulling away from Denial. She looked at me with an ugly, amused smirk. Helen set her glass down slowly. I looked at Denial, my voice trembling with raw shock, asking him what he was doing. Denial did not look ashamed. He did not stutter. He calmly set his glass on the side table, stood up, smoothed down his jacket, and looked at me as if I were a stranger who had interrupted a business meeting. He told me that I was never meant to find out like this, but that it saved him the trouble of an awkward conversation. He told me I was too weak, too broken, and that I simply did not fit into the future of the estate. When I screamed that this was my family's house, Helen stepped forward with pure venom in her eyes. She told me that my father was dead, my grandfather was on life support, and as the surviving legal spouse in the public records, she owned every square inch of the ground beneath my feet. She gave me 30 minutes to take whatever could fit into 2 plastic bags before she called private security to have me thrown out for criminal trespassing. When the security team arrived, they were men whose paychecks my family had signed for years, but they followed Helen's direct orders without hesitation. My things were thrown into black bags. When I reached down on the gravel driveway to pick up the small porcelain music box my mother had left me, Nicole stepped forward and kicked it straight into the mud, grinding the delicate porcelain into dust. Denial stood beside the iron gates, watching the rain pour over my head. He looked down at his watch, told me not to make an embarrassing scene, and swung the gate shut. The lock turned with a heavy, final clink. I fell to my knees on the wet asphalt, clutching 2 wet garbage bags, with $200 left in my bank account and nowhere to go. I slept in my old car in the hospital parking lot that night, shivering under a damp coat. But as the freezing hours ticked away, the sorrow inside me burned itself out. What took its place was not rage. It was an absolute, crystal clear stillness. At dawn, I washed the mud from my hands in the hospital bathroom and walked up to Grandfather Haroon's room. The rhythmic sound of the ventilator filled the quiet room. I sat beside him, took his fragile, paper-thin hand, and rested my head against the metal bed railing. I did not say a word, but suddenly, the weak fingers curled tightly around mine. Grandfather was awake. His breathing was strained, but his dark eyes were burning with undeniable awareness. He looked at my red eyes, my torn sleeves, and the bruises on my arms, and asked me what had happened. I broke down and told him everything. I told him about Denial's betrayal, Nicole's cruelty, Helen's threats, and the locked iron gates in the rain. For several long minutes, Grandfather did not make a sound. The monitor beeped with steady, rising intensity. The frailty in his expression vanished entirely, replaced by the lethal, calculating mind of the man who had outsmarted every corporate rival in the state for 50 years. He looked at me and told me to call Arthur Vance immediately. Arthur Vance was Grandfather's private attorney and lifelong confidant. Within an hour, Arthur arrived at the private room carrying a locked leather briefcase. Arthur sat beside the bed and laid out the reality Helen was too arrogant to see. Helen believed that because my father died without an updated individual will, the entire property defaulted to her as the surviving spouse. What Helen, Nicole, and Denial never knew was that Grandfather Haroon had never transferred the ownership of the sovereign to my father. 50 years ago, he had placed the mansion, the 60 surrounding acres, the commercial plaza in the valley, and all private accounts into an irrevocable private trust. The sole executive power belonged to Haroon, and Haroon alone. Grandfather took the heavy fountain pen from Arthur's hand. He looked at me, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron. He told me that cruel people mistake patience for weakness, and that it was time to let them see what happens when a foundation of greed collapses under its own weight. With a steady hand, 3 days before his final breath, my grandfather signed every single commercial title, the ancestral mansion, the trust funds, and the entire hillside commercial plaza, including the Grand Onyx, the city's most exclusive private club, directly, fully, and unconditionally into my name. 3 days later, Grandfather Haroon passed away quietly. I did not go to the lavish public funeral Helen staged. I watched from a distance as Helen, Nicole, and Denial put on a theatrical display of mourning for the city's elite, all while whispering to potential buyers about the upcoming sale of the estate. Denial was already introducing himself to venture capitalists as the managing partner of the Haroon legacy. Arthur Vance instructed me to vanish. He told me to let them dig their own financial graves. For 4 long years, I became a ghost to them. I rented a quiet apartment across town, completed my advanced degree in commercial law and property management, and allowed Arthur Vance to quietly run our family holdings under an anonymous private entity called SH Capital. Meanwhile, Denial and Helen were living on pure borrowed air. Assuming that the probate courts would eventually hand them the final public titles, Denial took out massive, high-interest speculative loans against his family's name. He leased exotic sports cars, bought Nicole designer wardrobes, and convinced an elite syndicate of high-profile investors that he held the master deed to turn the sovereign into a multi-million-dollar private resort. He promised his investors an exclusive signing gala to officially launch the redevelopment project. And to display his supreme status, Denial chose the most expensive, restricted venue in the city, the Grand Onyx Club. Last night was the 4th anniversary of my grandfather's passing. It was also the night Denial decided to throw his grand celebration. Denial had invited 30 of the region's wealthiest businessmen, city officials, and private equity investors. He had told everyone that tonight, he would personally sign the contracts that transferred the Haroon Empire into their new joint enterprise. At 8 in the evening, I entered the Grand Onyx through the private executive entrance. I was not wearing torn, rain-soaked clothes. I wore a tailored, emerald green silk blazer with sharp, clean lines. Around my neck was the real heirloom diamond necklace my mother had given me, which Arthur Vance had quietly recovered from Helen's private safe during the legal audit 3 months earlier, replacing it with a fake that Nicole never even noticed. I stood on the second-floor mezzanine behind the one-way glass, looking down at the grand lobby below. The club's general manager, Marcus, stood beside me with complete professional composure. Below us, Denial was in his element. He was wearing a custom velvet dinner jacket, holding a glass of aged whiskey, laughing loudly with 5 of his primary investors. Nicole was draped on his arm in a glittering gown, loudly bragging to the wives of local bankers about how exhausting it was overseeing such a massive historical restoration. Denial stepped up to the main VIP reception desk, leaned over the counter, and snapped his fingers for service. He announced to the entire room that he wanted the grand ballroom cleared, the private wine cellar unlocked, and the finest vintage brought out to toast the new king of the valley. He pulled out an American Express black card, slapped it firmly onto the marble counter, and told the staff to put the entire venue buyout on his personal tab. Marcus looked at me. I gave him a single, silent nod. Marcus descended the spiral marble stairs, flanked by 2 towering security officers. The loud chatter in the lobby settled down as the general manager stepped behind the desk. Denial gave Marcus an arrogant grin, extending his hand, assuming Marcus was coming to personally welcome him. He told Marcus that his guests were ready to move into the ballroom. Marcus did not shake his hand. Marcus did not smile. He picked up Denial's credit card, examined it for half a second, and pushed it straight back across the polished marble, leaving it resting against Denial's chest. Denial's grin instantly vanished. He asked Marcus if there was a problem with the card reader, stating that the account had an unlimited line of credit. Marcus looked at Denial with absolute calm and told him that the card was not the issue. The issue was that the entire venue, from the grand ballroom to the private terrace, had been placed under an exclusive private reservation earlier that afternoon. Nicole pushed forward, raising her voice so everyone could hear, demanding to know if Marcus realized who they were. She declared that they were the Haroon family, the owners of the entire hillside, and ordered Marcus to cancel whoever had booked the room immediately. Marcus looked Nicole dead in the eye and stated clearly that he could not do that, because the entire facility had been reserved personally by the legal owner of the property. Denial let out a loud, forced laugh, turning to his investors to play it off as a joke. He told Marcus that Helen Haroon was the sole owner, and that she had authorized this party herself. Marcus replied evenly that Helen Haroon did not own a single brick of this building, nor did she own the estate on the hill. The sound of my heels clicked against the marble steps of the spiral staircase. Every single conversation in the grand lobby died instantly. Denial turned his head toward the stairs. I walked down slowly, letting the silence press down on the room like a physical weight. I stopped on the 3rd step, looking directly down into Denial's face. The color completely drained from his skin. His mouth fell slightly open. The whiskey glass in his hand tilted, spilling amber liquid across his velvet sleeve, but he did not even flinch. He choked out my name like he had seen a phantom. Nicole gasped, stumbling back into one of the investors, screaming for security to throw this trespasser out of the club. Not a single security guard moved. The 2 officers at the main entrance simply stepped forward and clasped their hands behind their backs, standing at formal attention facing me. I looked down at Denial, letting a polite, effortless smile touch my lips. I wished him a very good evening. Denial was trembling now, looking frantically between Marcus, the guards, and me. He stammered, demanding to know what kind of sick joke this was. Marcus stepped to my side, bowed his head slightly, and announced to the entire gathering that the private buyout was held exclusively by Madame Saba Haroun, the sole legal owner of the Grand Onyx, the Commercial Valley District, and the historic Sovereign Mansion. The silence that followed was suffocating. The lead venture capitalist, a man Denial had been trying to sign for nearly a year, stepped forward with an icy expression. He looked at Denial and asked him why he had represented himself as the deed holder to an estate he clearly did not control. Denial completely lost his composure. Sweat began dripping down his temples. He started yelling that I was an estranged family member who had been disowned, that Helen was the legal heir, and that the probate courts were finalizing the transfer. I opened my leather folder and handed the court-certified documents directly to the lead investor. I told the room that the probate court had thrown out Helen's fraudulent claims 48 hours ago. Grandfather Haroun had placed every single asset into an irrevocable trust before his passing, naming me as the sole trustee and sole beneficiary. Denial held zero equity, zero property, and zero legal authority to sign any contract. The investor looked over the legal seals, turned to Denial with utter disgust, and told him that their firm was pulling every cent of funding, promising that their corporate lawyers would see him in federal court by morning. One by one, every wealthy guest Denial had invited turned their backs, walked past him, and exited through the heavy glass doors into the night. Denial stood in the center of the empty lobby, completely stripped of his illusion. I walked down the last 3 steps until I was standing inches away from him. I looked at his shaking hands, then looked straight into his terrified eyes. I reminded him of that stormy night 4 years ago. I reminded him how he had watched my life get thrown into the dirt, how he had checked his watch, and how he had slammed the iron gate shut because he believed I was worthless without money. I leaned in close and whispered that my grandfather was right about foundations built on vanity. I told him that 20 minutes ago, the county sheriff had served Helen and Nicole their official eviction notices at the Sovereign, and that the locks on the mansion gates were being changed right now. I looked at him and repeated the exact words he had spoken to me 4 years ago: "Pack your bags, do not make an embarrassing scene, it is truly pathetic." Nicole broke down into hysterical tears on the marble floor. Denial stood completely paralyzed, ruined, bankrupt, and utterly destroyed in front of the very staff he had tried to intimidate. I looked at Marcus and asked him to escort the trespassers off my property. The security guards took Denial and Nicole by their arms and walked them straight out through the revolving glass doors. I stood behind the warm, lit glass windows of the grand lobby and watched through the rain as Denial and Nicole stood on the wet curb, soaked in the cold, staring at the locked doors of an empire they would never touch again. Revenge does not need to be loud, and it does not need to be dirty. The most absolute justice is simply stepping back, building yourself in silence, and letting arrogant people destroy themselves on the very lies they tried to live by.